Welcome to tonight's journey, a slow journey through the entire history of Cambridge, the ancient university city beside the River Cam, where stone arches, quiet lawns, low bridges, and the soft glow of library windows seem to hold the breath of many centuries. Before we begin, allow yourself to slow down just a little. And if you would like, leave us a small comment telling us where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Tonight, we will begin not from the distant mud and earth of the past, but from the Cambridge that the world admires today, a city of renowned colleges, bicycles moving through old streets, punt boats drifting across the water, students walking beneath the shadow of King's College Chapel, and laboratories that once helped humanity look more deeply into matter, life, and the universe. But behind that beauty lies a very quiet question. Before Cambridge became a symbol of knowledge, what was it? From the radiant city of today, we will travel backward through time, returning to the river, the hill, the Roman footprints, the medieval market town, the first scholars, the stone colleges, the debates, the laboratories, and the quiet people who helped make Cambridge become Cambridge. Now, let the night fall gently. The River Cam is waiting for us ahead. Let us begin our journey on a very gentle afternoon in Cambridge, when the last light of the day still lingers on the old stone walls, and the River Cam drifts slowly, as though it is in no hurry to go anywhere. The surface of the water reflects the drooping arches of trees, the low bridges, the ancient rooftops, and the silhouette of King's College Chapel standing quietly beside the riverbank. On a nearby road, a few bicycles glide past almost silently. A distant bell rings, then fades into the air, leaving behind a stillness as soft as mist. At first glance, Cambridge seems like a city born for quietness, for reading, for walking beneath the trees, for sitting beside a window and thinking of distant things. But Cambridge is not only quiet. Behind that gentleness lies one of the most famous symbols of knowledge in the world. When people speak of Cambridge, they often think immediately of ancient colleges, lawns kept like green carpets, libraries deep with the scent of old paper, students wearing gowns on graduation day, and names that once changed the way humanity understood the universe. Life, matter, and itself. For many people, Cambridge is not merely a place on the map of England. It is almost an academic dream, an image of intelligence, discipline, tradition, and the desire to reach towards something greater than ordinary daily life. Today, when someone sets foot in Cambridge, the first thing they usually feel is not the noise of a large city. Cambridge does not greet people with skyscrapers or vast boulevards. This city opens itself through streets narrow enough to slow your footsteps, through brick and stone walls weathered by time, through college gates that open and close in silence, and through streams of people passing by as though they are joining a rhythm that has existed for a very long time. There are students hurrying to class, tourists looking up at chapel towers, people punting along the River Cam, professors, researchers, librarians, local residents, and even those who come here for only a single day yet still carry away the feeling that they have stepped into a place unlike anywhere else. Cambridge is a city, but it is also like an open book. Every street is a line of text. Every bridge is a pause. Every arch, window, wooden gate, bell tower, and courtyard holds a piece of memory. In the city center, the ancient buildings do not stand apart like decorations for visitors. They are part of everyday life. People still study, work, research, talk, debate, have lunch, ride bicycles, and live among walls that have witnessed many centuries passing by. That is what gives Cambridge its very special beauty. It is not a museum that has stopped breathing, but an ancient city still alive. Along the River Cam, punt boats drift past very slowly, almost without disturbing the surface of the water. The punter stands at the back, pressing a long pole gently against the riverbed. On both banks, lawns open wide, willow trees bow down, and the facades of colleges appear through the leaves. This is the area many people call the Backs, where several colleges turn their backs toward the river, creating one of the most famous scenes in Cambridge. In spring, a young green light settles over the grass and trees. In summer, the water glitters beneath the sun. In autumn, yellow leaves fall very softly, and on winter days, the city can become silver gray, cold, and still, as though the whole of Cambridge has been wrapped in a thin layer of mist. Looking up from the river, King's College Chapel often appears as the image many people remember most when they think of Cambridge. The building is tall, slender, dignified without needing to be loud. Its large windows, rising stone lines, vaulted forms, and ancient details make it feel like a reminder that human beings once spent many generations building things that did not merely serve the present, but were also offered to the future. By day, the chapel stands in the light. By evening, when the city softens, it becomes a solemn silhouette, reflecting itself into the water and the sky. But in this first chapter of our journey, we will only stand at a distance and look. We do not yet need to step deeply into the history of those stones. We only need to feel that Cambridge today is made of images like these, ancient, quiet, and strangely evocative. And yet, if we look at Cambridge only as a beautiful and old place, we will miss half of its soul, because alongside the chapels, stone courts, and old libraries, Cambridge is also a city of laboratories, research centers, technology companies, hospitals, scientific institutes, computer rooms, and conversations about the future. There are buildings that do not carry the ancient appearance of the old colleges, but inside them are people working with data, cells, new materials, artificial intelligence, medicine, physics, biology, technology, and many other fields. If the Cambridge beside the river makes people remember the past, then the Cambridge inside its laboratories is always looking ahead. It is this coexistence that makes the city so captivating. In Cambridge, you can walk through an old stone gate, see a quiet lawn like something from a painting, and then, after only a short distance, encounter modern research centers where people are trying to answer the questions of a new century. A morning here might begin with the sound of bells in an old neighborhood, continue with a lecture in a hall, and end with a meeting about biotechnology, computing, or advanced physics. Cambridge always gives people the sense that time does not move in a straight line. The past and the future seem to live beside each other, neither fighting nor overpowering the other, but together creating the city's own heartbeat. The University of Cambridge is the name that has made the city known throughout the world. But the university itself is not like the image of a single school with one main gate, one campus, and one clear boundary. It is more like a vast network, made up of colleges, departments, libraries, research institutes, lecture halls, and many academic spaces woven into the city. You can walk through Cambridge and sometimes find it difficult to say exactly where the city ends and where the university begins, because they have been bound together for so long. A street can be both a route for local residents and an entrance into a college. A cafe may have students reading beside tourists. A lawn may be both a beautiful view and part of ceremony, tradition, and student life. Here, prestige does not come only from age. It comes from the feeling that, over many centuries, countless people have entered Cambridge carrying great questions. Some asked about the movement of planets, some about the structure of life, some about the origin of species, some about mathematics, language, history, law, philosophy, medicine, computing, and society. Not every question was answered immediately. Not every answer was correct from the beginning. But Cambridge is famous because it became a place where asking questions is regarded as an essential part of life. In very quiet rooms, human beings may be thinking about very large things. To visitors, Cambridge may look like an old painting, but to those who live and study here, it is a place with a very real rhythm. In the morning, bicycles follow one another along the streets. Little bells ring when someone turns a corner. Shops open. Students walk quickly with backpacks and books. Rain may fall suddenly, making the stone pavement shine under a thin layer of water. In the libraries, desk lamps cast light down onto pages. In college dining halls, the sounds of knives, forks, quiet conversation, and old rituals continue. Outside, tourists pause to take photographs. And somewhere, in research areas farther from the center, instruments are still running, screens are still glowing, and another day of scientific work continues as usual. Cambridge is also a place of gentle contrasts. It has the solemnity of tradition, but also the youthfulness of a student city. It has old walls, but inside them, new generations are constantly arriving and leaving. It has an atmosphere of stillness, yet, in truth, it is always full of movement. Every year, students from many countries come here, bringing their own voices, habits, hopes, and anxieties. They cross bridges that many generations before them have crossed. They sit in libraries where countless others once bent their heads over books. They may feel very small before the depth of this place. But perhaps that is exactly why Cambridge gives them the feeling that they are becoming part of a current larger than their own individual lives. The year 1951 was an important milestone in Cambridge's administrative identity, when the place was officially granted city status. But what is interesting is that by the time Cambridge became a city in the official sense, in the imagination of many people, it had already long been a university city. It already had its symbols, rituals, streets, stories, colleges, debates, and a reputation that reached far beyond its actual size. The milestone of 1951 was like an official recognition of something that had quietly formed over many centuries. Cambridge was no longer merely a town famous for its university. It had become an urban place with its own identity, a place whose name was bound to learning, research, and cultural memory. Then came the year 1970, another milestone that opened a more modern direction for Cambridge, the development of Cambridge Science Park, initiated by Trinity College. This moment showed a Cambridge that did not only look back into the past. The city began to connect more strongly with high-technology industry, applied research, scientific enterprise, and the professions of the future. If the old colleges once symbolized the medieval and early modern world of scholarship, then the Science Park symbolized Cambridge stepping into a new age, where knowledge did not remain only in books or lecture halls, but entered laboratories, companies, instruments, inventions, and social life. This is what makes Cambridge different from many other ancient cities. Some places keep the past like a treasure, but slowly become distant from the present. Cambridge is different. It holds the past very deeply, but still allows the present to pass through it every day. A student may read in an ancient library, then later join a research project about new technology. A scientist may walk through streets that have existed for hundreds of years, then enter a modern building to work on questions that people of the past could never have imagined. A visitor may come for the chapel and the river, but leave with the feeling that Cambridge is not only a city of memory, it is also a city of possibility. In the evening, when the light in the windows begins to appear more clearly, Cambridge becomes especially suited to a story told before sleep. The city does not disappear into the night. It simply softens. The streets become less crowded. The River Cam grows darker. Tree shadows fall across the water. The bridges lie still between the two banks. Somewhere, a group of students is still talking quietly on the way home. A library room is still lit. A bicycle stands against a wall. A high window in a college still spills out a strip of golden light. All of it seems to remind us that knowledge is not always loud. Sometimes it grows in silence, in late hours of reading, in patience, in questions kept for a very long time before they find an answer. If we stood in Cambridge at that moment, we might understand why this city so easily enters the imagination of so many people. It is not only beautiful in a grand way, it is beautiful in a deep way. That beauty does not lie in one single building, one single street, or one single famous person. It lies in the slow accumulation of many layers of life, studying, traveling, building, debating, researching, failing, trying again, growing up, and leaving. Every generation that comes to Cambridge adds something to the city, even if it is very small. A book is written, an experiment is carried out, an idea is challenged. A student finds a direction for their life. A researcher lights up one tiny part of the unknown world. But precisely when Cambridge appears so beautiful and admirable, a new question begins to echo very softly. A city does not naturally become a symbol. A name does not naturally come to be spoken by the whole world with respect. Behind the lawns, chapels, laboratories, and reputation of today, there must have been another beginning, lower, rougher, humbler, and less glorious, before punt boats drifted by like scenes from a painting. The River Cam was once only a river in a low-lying landscape. Before there were colleges, there were roads, traders, river crossings, and very ordinary human footprints. So let us hold the image of Cambridge today in our minds for just a little longer, an ancient city that is still young, quiet yet constantly moving, full of tradition yet always opening its doors to the future. Remember the stone arches, the library lights, the sound of bicycles, the River Cam, and the slow boats upon the water, because from that radiant image, our journey will begin to move backward, not to take away the beauty of Cambridge, but to understand how that beauty could appear. Before there was a city admired by the whole world, there was a piece of land, a river, a hill, and the first people who passed through this place without knowing that. Much later, the name Cambridge would travel so far. Before Cambridge had its ancient arches, its silent lawns, its libraries deep with the scent of old paper, and the names respected across the world. This place began with things far simpler. There were no chapel bells, no students walking beneath the shadow of stone gates, no punt boats for visitors drifting slowly across the water like a scene from a painting. There was only a river, a low-lying landscape, a hill high enough to look out over the surroundings. And the first people who passed through this place stopped, observed, and realized that this was a place worth staying. If, in the previous chapter, we stood in the Cambridge of today, the city admired by the whole world, then now let that light slowly recede. Imagine the college walls dissolving into mist, the stone-paved streets vanishing, the familiar libraries, laboratories, chapels, and bridges slowly withdrawing from the scene. Before us, only an open land remains, low and damp, where the river bends through reeds, soft mud, and still pools of water. The wind moves across the plain, carrying the scent of earth, water, and wet grass, and nearby, a hill rises, not very high, but distinct enough to become a lookout point, a place of shelter, a place of memory. That hill would later be known as Castle Hill, but in the distant beginning, it did not yet bear that name. It was simply a raised place beside the river, somewhere human beings could stand and see a little farther. In a world without modern maps, without large bridges, without clearly marked streets, a place like that mattered greatly. From there, people could see the water, watch the natural passages through the lowland, observe wild animals, strangers, smoke, fire, crops, and the movements of life around them. Great cities do not always begin with ambition. Sometimes they begin with a very practical question. Where is there water? Where is there a way through? Where can one defend? And where can one live? The River Cam was an important part of that answer. Before it became a poetic image in modern eyes, before punt boats glided slowly beneath the willows, this river had already been a natural road through the lowlands of eastern England in the final centuries of the Iron Age. roughly several hundred years before Christ, until before the Romans set foot in Britannia in AD 43, the area around Cambridge was not yet a city, nor even a town. It was a wide, damp land of reeds, soft mud, small channels of water, and low plains gradually reaching toward the marshlands of the fenland. The water here was not only for drinking, fishing, or nourishing the plants along the banks. Water opened the way for movement. A river could connect a small settlement with places farther away, helping people carry simple goods, tools, materials, news, and even stories passed from mouth to mouth. Ancient people did not look at the River Cam as scenery to admire. They saw it as part of life itself, a quiet artery flowing through the land, guiding people away, drawing people in, and allowing a small place to remain connected to a wider world around it. In those very distant times, before the name Cambridge existed, the area near what is now Castle Hill already bore traces of native communities. This hill was not high in any grand sense, but in a low and damp landscape, even a modest rise was enough to become important. From there, people could look out toward the river, see the passages across wet ground, notice smoke from afar, watch animals moving, and observe strangers if they came near. It was precisely the combination of the river below and the higher ground above that gave this land value from a very early time, long before any scholar ever came here. Those first people left us no books, no written accounts of their own lives. They did not speak to us through writing. They spoke through earth, through pits, through fragments of pottery, through traces of ditches, banks, tools, and layers of habitation lying still beneath the ground for more than 2,000 years. Archaeology is like a very slow form of listening. It does not allow us to hear their voices in full, but it shows us that they once lived, once lit fires, once built shelters, once walked along the riverbank, once looked up at the gray sky of this lowland world when Cambridge had not yet entered the imagination of history. We can picture a very ancient morning on that land. Mist lies low over the reeds. The ground is still cold and wet after the long night. The River Cam flows quietly past soft muddy banks, with no stone bridge, no bell tower, no rows of red-tiled roofs, no college bells ringing through the air. On the higher ground near Castle Hill, a group of people wakes beside their settlement. Thin smoke rises from a fire. Someone repairs a fence or an earthwork. Someone checks the animals. Someone makes their way down toward the water, watching the first light of day open slowly across the river's surface. Life then was not glorious. It was not recorded under great names, nor did it have the ancient beauty that we now associate with Cambridge. But those small rhythms of life were the first layer of the story, before all fame, before the university, before the chapel, before the laboratories and libraries. This was already a land where people lived, where water flowed through, where smoke rose from fires, where footprints pressed into soft mud. And from those very ordinary things, Cambridge began to have a past of its own. Then another age arrived, when the Romans expanded their power across the island of Britannia. They brought with them more than soldiers. They brought a very particular way of seeing roads, order, military control, commerce, and urban life. To them, river crossings, hills, and routes of movement had strategic meaning. The area around Castle Hill lay close to the river and held a favorable position for controlling movement. So it is not difficult to understand why the Romans paid attention to this place. Around the 1st century AD, this area is believed to have had a small fort, a sign that the land beside the river had begun to enter the wider network of Rome. Imagine that scene slowly. On the hill that once held only native footprints, there now appear heavier, more regular steps. Timber is raised. Defensive ditches are dug. Soldiers look down toward the water, watching the crossings, the paths, the distant movements across the lowland. This is still not the Cambridge of chapels and books. This is a place of watchfulness, control, and military presence. But the arrival of Rome changed the rhythm of the land. It drew this place into a broader system, where roads, rivers, and power were bound together. Over time, that military trace gave way to a more civilian settlement. The Roman name often associated with this place is Duroli Ponte. Beneath the Cambridge of today, there was once a small Roman settlement with streets, houses, gardens, trade, and people living in the shadow of a distant empire. We can imagine modest roads, timber houses, backyards, everyday objects, voices speaking in different accents, and journeys moving back and forth between this river landscape and other places in Roman Britannia. A small town does not need to be splendid in order to matter. Sometimes it only needs to stand in the right place, beside a river, on a line of movement, for time to begin gathering around it. Duroli Ponte was not Rome. It was not a magnificent city with a great arena or marble buildings that left people overwhelmed. It was smaller, more practical, closer to everyday life. But it is precisely that modesty that makes it feel near to us. There may have been repairmen, sellers, former soldiers, travelers stopping on their way, people carrying goods, children running through yards, someone lighting a fire as evening came. When we think of history, we often remember kings, scholars, and great buildings. But a place like Cambridge was first made by ordinary lives, by people who did not know that their footprints would become the opening of a story lasting thousands of years. When Roman power weakened and withdrew from Britannia, the world around the River Cam changed once again. The roads may still have been there, but not with the same order. Buildings were abandoned, altered, reused, or slowly fell into ruin. The departure of an empire does not mean that human beings disappear. Life continued, but in forms more local, more scattered, harder to see through the mist of time. This is one of those stretches of history through which we must walk very gently, because not everything was clearly recorded. We only know that this land did not cease to be used, did not cease to be crossed, and that new layers of people gradually covered the traces of the old. After the Roman period, this area passed through the Anglo-Saxon centuries, a time when names, power, language, and life on English soil changed deeply. New communities formed, new connections were created. The river still flowed, the hill was still there, but people saw them through different names and different habits. Some Roman traces may still have remained visible in the landscape: an old stretch of road, a mound, a fragment of wall. Materials reused for new purposes. People who live after an earlier age do not always need to know the full past of the place where they dwell. They simply use what remains, build houses, farm, cross the river, trade in small ways, pray, have children, bury their dead, and continue living. It is this quiet current that makes the history of Cambridge far deeper than its modern beauty. Cambridge did not appear like a miracle in the year 1209, nor did it begin when the colleges rose, before the scholars came, before the town became famous, before the name Cambridge became tied to knowledge. This place had already held many centuries of earth, water, timber, cooking smoke, paths, defense, and human settlement. Each layer of people who passed through did not completely erase the layer before. They left something behind, sometimes very small, lying beneath the feet of later generations. Then, in the 11th century, a major event changed this land once more. In 1066, the Normans conquered England. After that victory, the new power needed to be placed upon the land in forms that could be seen. A castle was one of the strongest ways to do that. In 1068, William the Conqueror ordered the construction of Cambridge Castle on the raised ground near the river. Once again, the old hill became a center of power, a place that had held ancient settlement. Then Roman traces, then later layers of life, now became a site where a new regime asserted its control. Imagine that change through the eyes of someone living nearby. One morning, workers and soldiers arrive. Earth is dug up, timber, stone, tools, and orders appear. Familiar space is measured out again. Houses may have to give way, according to the record in Domesday. Houses were destroyed to make room for the castle, for Norman power. This may have been a strategic decision, but for ordinary people, it was a very real disruption, a home lost, a path altered, the shadow of a new fortress falling across daily life. Cambridge Castle no longer survives intact as it did in that time. What remains today is only a very small part, but its meaning within the story is still great. It reminds us that before Cambridge became a place of scholarship, this was once a place of military power and control. A city is not built only with books. It is also built with political decisions, with fear of rebellion, with the need to govern, with defensive structures, and sometimes with the loss endured by ordinary people who had to make way for a new order. From that hill, we can look back over this entire chapter as though through many layers of mist. The first layer is the natural land, the river, the low ground, the reeds, the soft mud, the wide sky. The next layer is the early communities, people who knew where one could live, where one could cross the river, where one could see far. Then came the Romans, bringing a fort, roads, the name Duro li Ponte, and a larger network. After that came the transitional centuries, when old power withdrew and life continued in forms harder to see. And finally came the Normans, placing a castle on the hill, marking that this place still held strategic value, still remained a point worth controlling. What matters is that none of these stages had yet created the glorious Cambridge we see in the modern imagination. There was no university, no colleges, no King's College Chapel, no laboratories or famous names of science. But the foundations were there. The river was there. The hill was there. The roots had begun to form. Human beings had grown used to stopping, living, trading in small ways, defending, passing through, building, and leaving traces behind. A place needs such things before it can become a great city in the memory of humankind. And perhaps this is what makes the history of Cambridge beautiful in such a quiet way. Its radiance did not appear at the beginning. It grew very slowly from things that were not radiant at all, from a stretch of water that could be crossed, from a high point that could watch the land, from a few footprints on wet earth, from small houses, from an old road, from a vanished fortress, from layers of unnamed people who still made this place continue to exist through century after century. Tonight, when we think again of modern Cambridge, the boats gliding along the River Cam may carry a different meaning beneath the peaceful surface of the water. We can imagine deeper layers of time flowing below. That river had seen human beings arrive before the city had a famous name. That hill had stood there before the castle was raised, and that land had quietly prepared for a new chapter, when Cambridge would no longer be only a place to pass through, defend, or inhabit, but would gradually become a town beside the river, where markets, goods, privileges, and urban life began to open. But that story we will leave for the next part. After the very distant layers of mist from the ancient land, after the river, the hill, the Roman footprints, and the shadow of the Norman castle, Cambridge begins to appear more clearly as a place with everyday life. Not the Cambridge of famous colleges, not the Cambridge of soaring chapels or libraries deep with the scent of old paper, but a lower Cambridge, a damper Cambridge, one closer to earth and water, a town beside the river where people woke to the sounds of animals, wooden wheels, voices calling to one another in the market, boats touching softly against the bank, and the smell of cooking smoke mingled with the scent of wet morning mud. Before the year 1066, Cambridge already had a food market. That may sound very simple, but in the history of a place, a market is an important sign. A market means that people are no longer living only in scattered, isolated houses. A market means that someone is bringing vegetables, fish, meat, grain, eggs, hides, wool, salt, bread, and household goods to a common point. It means there are buyers, sellers, bargaining voices, scales and measures, people who remember one another's faces, people passing on news, and people listening to stories brought from other regions. A market does not only exchange goods, it exchanges the rhythm of life. It gives a place a center. Imagine a morning in Cambridge at that time. Mist still lies low over the ground. The River Cam moves slowly along the edge of the town, its surface gray-green, quiet but far from useless. The roads are still muddy after rain. Wooden wheels leave deep tracks in the earth. From low houses, people step outside, pulling their cloaks tighter against the cold. A woman carries a basket of eggs to the market. A man leads an animal through a narrow passage. Someone else carries a sack of grain over his shoulder. From a distance, you might hear chickens, dogs, children, and wooden doors opening into the damp air of eastern England. The town then did not yet have the polished beauty we associate with Cambridge today. It may have been rough, small, and full of the very real smells of life. The smell of wet straw, the smell of coal smoke, the smell of river fish, the smell of tanned leather, the smell of mud clinging to shoes, the smell of newly baked bread drifting from a house near the market. But it was precisely those smells that made Cambridge a living place. Before people came here for knowledge, they came because they needed to buy and sell, to cross the river, to repair tools, to hear news, to find a meal, to find a place to rest, to feel the presence of other people in a world still wide and not easy to travel. The River Cam remained the artery of the town. It was not noisy like a grand avenue, but it drew Cambridge out of isolation, on the water. Small boats could carry goods, materials, food, timber, wool, grain, or the everyday necessities of life. The riverbank was not a place for admiring the scenery as it is in the modern imagination. It was a place of labor. People pulled boats to shore, tied ropes, carried goods down, checked sacks, and called to one another over the sound of the water. Sometimes a merchant arriving from far away brought not only goods, but also news, a good harvest in another region, a damaged road, word about the king, a certain item rising in price, or a strange story heard in a distant town. After around the year 1100, when routes through the river system became more favorable, Cambridge had even greater conditions to grow as a point of trade. The rivers connecting this region with Ely, Lynn, and routes out toward the sea did not only bring goods into Cambridge, they also carried Cambridge outward into the wider world. For people today, movement is something familiar, but for people in the Middle Ages, a safe and useful river route could change the fate of an entire town. It helped this place do more than simply feed itself. It allowed Cambridge to take part in a broader network of trade. Gradually, Cambridge became a stopping point, a gathering point for goods, a place of exchange, a place that gave travelers a reason to remember it. Life around the market therefore grew denser. Let us walk slowly through a market day. Under temporary coverings, stalls are set up. Someone sells fish caught from the river or nearby waters, placing them on damp straw to keep them fresh a little longer. Someone sells vegetables, roots, beans, onions, apples, bread, butter, cheese, or meat hanging above the stall. Someone else brings wool, coarse cloth, rope, small knives, nails, pottery, or wooden goods. Conversation rises in layers, not too violent, but continuous like flowing water. A buyer picks up an item, examines it carefully, says it is too expensive, sets it down, then comes back again. The seller is used to this. The market is where people earn a living, but it is also where they measure one another's character. In one corner of the market, someone may be retelling stories from outside the town. News in those days did not arrive through daily newspapers or a glowing screen in the hand. It came from the mouths of travelers. A merchant stopping for rest might speak of wool prices elsewhere. A pilgrim might talk about a distant church. A soldier or a lord's servant might bring stories of war, taxes, or shifts in power. Each story passed through the market like an invisible item of trade. People listened, remembered, retold, added, questioned, and then carried it home when evening came. Cambridge at that time was also a place of inns, rented rooms, small workshops, and trades serving those who came and went. A town beside the river did not only need people selling food, it needed blacksmiths to repair horseshoes, mend knives, make hinges, and produce tools. It needed carpenters to repair carts, mend doors, make barrels, and build stalls. It needed bakers, brewers, tanners, carriers, ostlers, boatmen, and porters. Each trade left behind its own sound, the hammer striking metal, the saw drawing through wood, the thud of a barrel set down on the ground, the sound of water being poured into a trough, the crackle of fire in a furnace. Those sounds were not recorded ceremoniously in history books, but they were the true background music of Cambridge before its age of glory. When a place trades more, it also needs clearer rules. Who may sell where? Who may collect fees? Who keeps order? Who settles disputes? Who represents the town before greater powers? For that reason, the growth of Cambridge was not only about having more goods or more people coming to market. It was also about the town beginning to gain status and privileges. By around the year 1200, Cambridge had become a commercial community, developed enough to hold a significant role in the region. It was a county town, a place with a market, with urban life, with trading activity strong enough to make royal power take notice. The year 1207 was a very important milestone. King John granted Cambridge a charter, giving the town the right to elect a mayor. A charter may sound dry, but if we place it inside human life, we can feel its weight. It was not merely a document written on parchment or paper. It was a recognition. It said that this town had a community large enough, important enough, and organized enough to have a leader elected by its own people, from a place beside the river, with a market and boats carrying goods. Cambridge began to take on a clearer shape as an urban community. Picture the day that news spread through the town. Perhaps not everyone understood the full legal meaning of a royal charter. A fish seller may still have had to worry about selling everything before nightfall. A blacksmith still had to finish repairing tools. A mother still had to pull her child out of the mud when the child ran too close to the wagon road. But at a deeper level, the town had changed. It was no longer only a place where people gathered to live. It began to have a voice, a representative, a ritual, a sense that it was a recognized community. The right to elect a mayor gave Cambridge a new symbol of urban order, even though the life beneath that symbol was still full of mud, smoke, noise, and ordinary worries. We can imagine the first mayor, or those who held local leadership roles, walking through the narrow streets of Cambridge. There were no bright city lights, no perfectly paved square, no modern administrative buildings. There was only a town growing little by little, where power was felt through meetings, fees, market disputes, rules about goods, and negotiations with powers beyond the town itself. An urban community is not made only of houses. It is made by the habit of living together under certain shared rules. And around those years, on the edge of Cambridge, another image began to open, Stourbridge Fair. In 1211, King John granted a privilege to the leper chapel at Stourbridge to hold a small fair for fundraising. At first, it was tied to a modest and humane purpose, supporting a place that cared for the sick on the outskirts of town. But over time, This fair would grow very large, becoming one of the famous fairs of medieval England. In this chapter, we only see it at its beginning, when everything had not yet become enormous. A piece of land near the road, near the water, a few stalls, a few calls, a few people coming to buy and sell, and a seed of commerce freshly planted. The atmosphere of a fair was different from that of an ordinary market. The ordinary market was the rhythm of familiar life. A fair was an event. It made the town more expectant. People came from far away. Strange goods appeared. Unfamiliar voices rang out. Children saw things they had never seen before. Adults calculated what to buy, what to sell, what to trade, and what to keep. Temporary taverns were set up. Fresh timber was driven into the ground. Canvas was stretched overhead. The smells of food, animals, mud, smoke, and people mixed into an atmosphere that was very medieval, very crowded, and yet full of life. There, we can see merchants opening their packs in the early morning. Cloth is spread out, knives, cords, small metal goods, pottery, leather, wool, spices, household items, and food are laid on display. A traveler stops before an object, asks the price, shakes his head, laughs, and offers less. The seller answers with a sentence half joking, half serious. A horse pulling a cart passes by, splashing mud near the feet of someone standing beside it. A child tries to peer over an adult's shoulder. A sick person is brought past near the chapel. A monk or a servant of the hospital watches the crowd. Knowing that the money raised may help sustain the place that cares for those whom society has pushed to the margins. It is here that Cambridge appears not only as a center of trade, but as a place that also contains the fragility of life. Beside goods, there is illness. Beside laughter, there is fear of contagion. Beside royal privilege, there are very vulnerable lives. The leper chapel and the fair around it remind us that a town is not built only from success and growth. It is also shaped by how human beings face sickness, poverty, exclusion, and the need for care in gentle historical stories. We do not need to make everything heavy, but neither should we forget that beneath the lively surface of markets and fairs were very real human lives. As afternoon descended on Cambridge in that time, the market gradually changed its mood. Morning was the time of calling and bargaining. Noon was the smell of food, mud trampled underfoot, goods slowly diminishing. By late afternoon, people began gathering what had not been sold. Sacks were tied shut. Wooden barrels were lifted onto carts. Coins were counted by hand. Buyers carried goods home. The roads were muddier after a day of being walked across. The river still flowed nearby, receiving the last light of the day. A few boats prepared to leave the bank, carrying goods, people, news, and the stories of Cambridge elsewhere. Inside the houses, evening life became smaller again. A family sat near the fire. Bread was divided. Someone retold a story heard in the market. Children asked about the stranger who had brought some unusual item from far away. A man was tired after carrying loads all day. A woman checked how much food remained for tomorrow. Outside, the town gradually quieted. Though it did not sleep completely, in an inn, travelers still spoke softly. On the riverbank, someone was still tying a boat's rope. Somewhere, an animal called in the night. The Cambridge of that time was not splendid, but it was full of breath. What is worth noticing is that all these forms of daily life had prepared Cambridge for a great change that the people living then may not yet have recognized. A town with a market, inns, rented rooms, people selling food, a river route, urban privileges, a commercial life, and the ability to receive people from elsewhere was precisely the kind of place that could welcome new communities. Before Cambridge became a place of scholars, it had already become a place capable of feeding strangers. Before there were colleges, there were rooms to rent. Before there were libraries, there was a market where people exchanged things. Before there were academic debates, there were voices bargaining, voices asking prices, voices telling stories, and the voices of strangers bringing news from far away. Night falls over the town beside the river. The River Cam grows quiet in the darkness. The stalls have been taken down or covered. The mud on the road begins to turn cold. Smoke rises from the low rooftops. In that stillness, Cambridge does not yet know that another turning point is drawing very near. It does not know that, before long, those who come here will no longer be only merchants, market-goers, the sick, craftsmen, or travelers passing through. There will be people arriving with books, Latin, questions, arguments, and a new way of life. But before they step into the story, let us remember Cambridge as it once was, a town beside the water, damp, small, crowded, filled with the smell of smoke and mud, yet already alive enough to open itself to a future larger than itself. At the beginning of the 13th century, Cambridge was still not the name that the whole world would one day look up to. It was a town beside the river, with a market, cargo boats, muddy roads after the rain, inns, rented houses, churches, bread sellers, porters, craftsmen, innkeepers, and people who lived by the rhythm of everyday trade. The River Cam still flowed through the town as before, quietly carrying goods and news from one place to another. In the morning, local people still opened their doors, led animals outside, brought goods to the market, lit their hearths, and called to one another through narrow lanes still damp with mist. None of them could have known that a small group of strangers arriving here with books and very different habits of study would change this town forever. In 1209, scholars from Oxford came to Cambridge after serious conflicts between students and townspeople in Oxford. They did not arrive like a great army, nor did they come to buildings already prepared for them. They came as people who needed shelter, rented rooms, places to lecture, tables, chairs, light, food, and enough peace to continue studying. They may not have carried much wealth in their belongings, but they brought with them things very different from the familiar rhythm of Cambridge at that time: books, Latin, lectures, debates, the habits of reading, taking notes, memorizing, arguing, and pursuing questions to the very end. Imagine an afternoon when some of the first scholars stepped into the town. The road was still soft after rain. Mud clung to their shoes. A horse-drawn cart passed by, leaving deep tracks behind, from the market. The sound of bargaining still rose into the air. From an inn, the smell of ale, bread, and cooking smoke drifted out through the door. The local people looked at the newcomers with curiosity mixed with caution. They were not ordinary merchants, nor were they quite monks living in a monastery. They were people of books, usually dressed simply but with a different manner, speaking about things that a fish seller or blacksmith in the town might find strange. But they still had to ask the price of a room, still had to buy food, and still had to live among the small streets of Cambridge like everyone else. What is interesting is that the university did not immediately appear in the form we usually imagine. There was no great gate opening and announcing that from that day forward, Cambridge was a center of learning. In the beginning, everything was much smaller. Scholars rented rooms in private houses or inns. An ordinary room could become a place for lectures. A corner of a house could hold a few precious books. A group of students might sit crowded around a teacher, listening to each sentence in Latin, then committing it to memory as best they could, because books at that time were rare and expensive. Knowledge did not rest on the wide shelves of large libraries as it does today. It lived in the mouth of the lecturer, in the memory of the learner, and in carefully preserved handwritten manuscripts. Cambridge began to change, not with a loud explosion, but through very small shifts in the rhythm of everyday life. A landlord took in another scholar as a tenant. A bread seller found that more young customers were buying food in the morning. An inn began to hear unfamiliar conversations in the evening. On the streets, people encountered groups of young students passing by, some serious, some mischievous, some still very inexperienced. Many students of that time were still very young, perhaps only in their teenage years, far from home, living in a town that was not their own, under the authority of their teachers, yet still carrying the impulsiveness of youth. And from this point, tension began to appear. A town accustomed to trade and to its own daily rhythm suddenly had a new community, one that needed to be served while also demanding its own privileges. The townspeople had rooms to rent, food to sell, goods, and services that the scholars needed. The scholars had the status of learned men, ties to the church, and increasingly clear protection from outside powers. The two sides needed each other, but they did not always understand each other. Landlords might want to raise the rent, students might cause trouble, owe money, or behave arrogantly. Small clashes in inns, in the market, on the street, or in rented lodgings could become the seeds of larger disputes. Try looking at Cambridge through the eyes of an ordinary townsman in those years. He might be a blacksmith, waking early, lighting his forge, repairing horseshoes, making tools, hearing the sound of his own hammer ringing through the cold morning. Before. His customers were mostly people from the region, merchants, carriers, and travelers. Now, on the streets, there were young men speaking Latin to one another, discussing logic, theology, law, and philosophy, things that did not help shoe a horse faster or make bread cheaper. But they still needed small knives, iron hooks, hinges, lamps, candles, beds, tables, and food. And so, even if they were difficult to understand, they became a new part of the town's economy. But if we look through the eyes of a young student newly arrived, Cambridge appears in another way. He may have come from a distant region, carrying little money, a few personal belongings, and the hope that learning would open the door to a different life. He stepped into a cramped, rented room, where several others had already slept on simple bedding. In the morning, he had to wake early, go to lectures, memorize, debate, keep discipline, and sometimes endure hunger or cold. Outside was the town, with its market, taverns, calling voices, and very worldly temptations. Inside was the world of books, teachers, rules, prayers, and long arguments. For him, Cambridge was both a place of study and a place of testing. By 1226, the community of scholars in Cambridge had become large enough and stable enough to have its own organization. Represented by a chancellor, this was an important milestone, because it showed that those who had come to Cambridge in 1209 were not merely a few temporary groups of students. They had taken root. They had formed an ordered community, with a head, with a voice, and with a need to protect their own rights. Once that community had a representative, the relationship between scholars and townspeople also became clearer. Cambridge was no longer only a place that rented rooms and sold food to learners. It began to become a space where the academic world had an official presence. But that official presence also made daily life more complicated. When one group of people had privileges, another group could feel disadvantaged. When students were protected, townspeople might feel that they were harder to punish, like ordinary people. When landlords raised prices, scholars felt exploited. When students caused trouble, townspeople felt that their own lives had been disrupted. Cambridge thus entered into a long relationship between town and gown, between the townspeople and the people of the university. That phrase would later become familiar, but even from the beginning, it already had its shape in the small clashes of daily life. In 1231, King Henry III placed the Cambridge scholars under royal protection and tried to limit the ways in which they could be exploited by innkeepers or landlords. This milestone may sound like an administrative decision, but in real life, it could change the feeling of power in the town. A young scholar, even if poor, even if living in a rented room, was no longer merely an ordinary lodger. He belonged to a community that had drawn the attention of the king. Meanwhile, landlords, sellers, local officials, and townspeople had to grow used to living beside a group of people who both needed them and were not entirely under their control. Imagine an evening in an inn. At one wooden table sit a few local people, tired after a long day of work. In another corner is a group of students, talking eagerly, one of them laughing loudly, another arguing with words that those around him do not fully understand. The innkeeper is pleased to have customers, but also worried, because these young men may become noisy, fall into debt, or bring trouble to his door. Outside, a cold wind moves through the small street. Inside, firelight flickers across the faces of everyone in the room. Nothing in that scene resembles the solemn image of Cambridge in later centuries. Yet it was from evenings like this that university life was trying to make its way into the life of the town. Lectures at that time were also very different from modern classrooms. The teacher often read from or lectured on an authoritative text. Students listened, memorized, asked questions, and took part in debate. Learning was not a matter of sitting comfortably in a bright lecture hall. It could mean long hours in a cold room, with weak light, a tired body, and a mind stretched tight to follow the argument. Books were so precious that not everyone had a copy of their own. A piece of knowledge might pass from teacher to student through the voice, through memory, through repetition and repeated debate. Cambridge began to become a place where the sound of the market and the sound of lectures existed together in the same town. In the small streets, the townspeople gradually learned to recognize these new groups. Some were masters, more serious, older, responsible for their students. Some were new students, still unfamiliar with discipline, easily drawn into amusement or quarrels. Some were poor, clinging to learning as a path toward a different life. Some came from wealthier families, carrying the confidence of their class. This diversity made Cambridge younger, more unsettled, noisier, and harder to predict. A commercial town beside the river began to acquire the rhythm of youth, scholarship, and ambitions that reached beyond local life. But not every change brought tension. The arrival of the scholars also brought opportunity. Local people had more tenants, food sellers had more customers, scribes, parchment sellers, candle makers, tailors, inn-servants, cooks, washerwomen, and repairers of everyday objects could all find new work. A scholarly community, even a small one, still needed an entire world of ordinary labor to support it from behind. For one person to sit and study, someone had to make bread. For a lecture to take place, there had to be a room, chairs, light, shelter, and a fire for warmth. For knowledge to exist, there had to be a town patient enough to feed it. This is a very important point in the story of Cambridge. The university did not stand outside the city like a separate kingdom, completely apart from everything else. From the very beginning, it lived through the houses, streets, riverbank, market, and people of Cambridge. Scholars might debate lofty matters, but they still needed an evening meal. Students might study logic, theology, law, and philosophy, but they still had to pay rent. The town might be irritated by them, but it also benefited from them. That relationship was not entirely gentle, but it was full of life. And it was precisely that liveliness that began to give Cambridge a new identity. As time went on, the need to organize academic life became clearer. Scattered rented rooms were not enough to maintain discipline and protect students. Teachers needed more stable spaces. Students needed housing with clearer supervision. Tension with the townspeople also made the academic community want safer areas, its own rules, overseers, and a more tightly bound communal life. From that need, the road toward the colleges slowly opened. But in this chapter, we stand only at the threshold of that change. What matters is not the completed stone buildings, but the sense that a new form of life was slowly taking shape in the town beside the river. In the years after 1209, Cambridge was like a house being changed from within. On the outside, the market still gathered. Boats still came to the bank. Local people still sold goods, repaired tools, cooked, lit fires, argued, raised children, paid taxes, attended church, and lived through the turning of the seasons. But within that old rhythm, a new sound had begun to rise, the sound of study, of Latin reading, of debate, of teachers lecturing, of students hurrying through the streets. Those sounds may have been small at first, even irritating to some. But over time, they became an inseparable part of Cambridge. We can imagine a late autumn day in the town. Wet leaves cling to the ground. A cold wind blows up from the river. A group of students passes through the market, pulling their garments close, speaking to one another about the lesson ahead. A seller watches them go by, recognizing a few faces, disliking a few others, but knowing they will return to buy bread, ale, candles, or ink in a nearby room. A teacher prepares his lecture. On the table lies a carefully preserved text. Outside, Cambridge is still the town of mud, smoke, fish, boats, and market stalls. Inside that room, another Cambridge is opening its eyes. No one at that time could stand in the middle of the street and see the future ahead. No one could have known that this place would one day become one of the most famous centers of learning in the world. To the townspeople of that age, the scholars who arrived in 1209 may have seemed only a troublesome, useful, strange group, sometimes respectable, sometimes irritating. To the scholars themselves, Cambridge may have been only a new refuge, a place where they could continue their studies after the upheaval in Oxford. But history often begins that way. The greatest changes do not always introduce themselves with splendor. They enter life with ordinary footsteps. And when night fell, the town beside the river Cam sank again into darkness. The market stalls grew silent. The riverbank became emptier. Smoke from the low rooftops dissolved into the cold air. In a rented room, perhaps a candle still burned. A student bent over his studies. A teacher corrected his notes. Outside, the people of Cambridge rested after a day of trade. Those two worlds, the town and the world of learning, were still far from living in complete harmony. But they had begun to live beside each other, to look at each other, to need each other, to collide with each other, and to create something new together. From 1209 onward, Cambridge was no longer only the river town of markets, boats, and urban privileges. It began to become a place of books, of learners, of debate, and of an intellectual community searching for its place. The River Cam still flowed as before, but along its banks another current had appeared, quieter and harder to see, the current of knowledge. It was that current that would gradually lead Cambridge from small rented rooms to stone courts, chapels, libraries, and colleges, where the city would begin to take on the shape that the whole world would recognize many centuries later. After the early years filled with clashes between the townspeople and the scholars, Cambridge began to change its shape. That change did not come in a single day, nor did it immediately appear like the familiar images we see today. The square lawns, stone gates, soaring chapels, and ancient libraries did not suddenly rise together beside the River Cam. In the beginning, academic life was still very simple. A teacher lectured in a rented room. A group of students crowded around a wooden table. A small candle burned in a draught. Precious books were guarded carefully like the shared treasure of an entire community. Cambridge at that time was still a town of mud, markets, carts, horses, and the smell of cooking smoke. But inside that town, a new way of life was searching for a more lasting form. Rented rooms could be enough for a short time, but they could not forever sustain a growing scholarly community. Students needed housing with greater discipline. Teachers needed more stable spaces for lecturing and managing their pupils. Young men far from home needed to be supervised, fed, guided in prayer, study, and life according to a shared order. In a town full of temptations, many inns, and frequent friction with local people, the scholars gradually realized that they needed more than a few scattered rooms. They needed a place that could be home, school, spiritual community, and a protective wall against the disorder outside. From that need, the idea of the college gradually became important. In the context of Cambridge, a college was not simply a school, it was a common home. It was a place where learners ate together, prayed together, lived under the management of a head, studied according to a fixed rhythm, and were gradually brought into a tradition. A college was like a small world closed behind a gate. Outside were the market, the taverns, the sound of bargaining, and the wheels rolling through mud. Inside were stone courts, dining halls, chapels, sleeping rooms, books, lectures, and long hours of reading in dim light. In 1284, Peterhouse was founded, becoming the first college of Cambridge. From a modern point of view, we might immediately think of an old and prestigious institution, with beautiful architecture and a deep tradition. But try to return in imagination to that first moment. Peterhouse was not born as a complete symbol. It began as a very practical effort to create a stable place for scholars to live and study. After many decades in which scholars had depended on rented houses, the founding of a college was like Cambridge laying its first stone for an academic life with a place of its own. Imagine a morning in the early years of Peterhouse. The air is still cold. Mist clings to rooftops and stone walls. A few scholars walk across the court, pulling their gowns close around them. From the dining hall, the smell of porridge, bread, and cooking smoke drifts out. Some speak softly to one another in Latin. Some are still sleepy after a long night of study. Footsteps echo over stone or packed earth. Somewhere in a corner, a teacher prepares his lecture. On the table are handwritten texts, not many, but precious. Everything is still small, still poor, still enclosed. Yet it is precisely that smallness that creates a very clear feeling. Cambridge is no longer merely a place where scholars lodge temporarily. Cambridge is beginning to have houses of knowledge. From Peterhouse, a new pattern slowly opened. The college became the way Cambridge organized academic life. Each college could have its own history, its own founder, its own property, its own rules, its own chapel, its own dining hall, and its own community. But all of them contributed to the shared appearance of Cambridge. Instead of scholars living scattered through inns and rented houses, the city gradually saw spaces built specifically for learning. Stone replaced temporary shelter. Courtyards replaced lonely rented rooms. College gates replaced indoors, opening onto noisy streets. Cambridge began to change from a town with scholars into a city where learning was built into the very landscape. By 1347, Pembroke College was founded. A milestone like this did not simply add another name to the list of colleges. It showed that Cambridge's growth had gained momentum. Each new college was a sign that more people believed in the future of this place, believed that learning deserved land, money, buildings, laws, and a long-lasting way of life. In a medieval world full of uncertainty, where war, disease, poverty, and changes in power could make human life fragile, building a college was a very special act. It said that knowledge needed a home, and that home was not only for the present, but also for those not yet born. Life inside the first colleges was not as gentle as the image visitors would later see. It was a disciplined life. Students woke at fixed hours. They ate according to rules. They studied, prayed, listened to lectures, debated, copied notes, read texts, and lived under supervision. In winter, the rooms could be very cold. Light was scarce. Beds were simple. Food was not always abundant, but in return, they had something that scattered rented rooms could not fully provide: the feeling of belonging to an academic community. They were no longer just young men lost in the town. They were members of a common house, bearing the name of a college, living within an order that had memory. Try stepping through the gate of a medieval college at dusk. Outside, Cambridge still carries the sounds of the market, animals, people calling to one another, and boats on the river. But when the gate closes, the sound softens. A courtyard opens before you, perhaps not yet perfect, not yet as smooth and green as the lawns of later centuries, but already carrying the feeling of separation from the street. The surrounding walls create a pocket of quiet. The dining hall stands on one side, the chapel on another. Small windows cast weak light. A few scholars pass by, heads lowered, carrying books or notes in that space. Cambridge begins to learn how to grow quiet. The chapel was the spiritual heart of many colleges. For people in the Middle Ages, learning and religious life were not separated in the way many modern people might imagine. A day of study could begin and end with prayer. Questions about philosophy, law, theology, ethics, and the universe all belonged to a world in which faith surrounded daily life. For that reason, the chapel was not merely a beautiful, decorative building. It was where the community looked back upon itself, where young people were reminded that knowledge was not only for debate, but also connected to the soul, responsibility, and the order of the world they believed God had preserved. As the colleges grew, Cambridge also gradually changed in appearance. Stone buildings endured longer than market tents, wooden houses, or temporary rented rooms. They created new lines of sight, new roads, new habits. A townsman walking past might see a college gate rising higher than the houses around it. A child growing up in Cambridge might become used to seeing scholars pass through the streets as a normal part of life. A builder might find work because of the new construction. A carpenter might make tables, doors, roofs, and bookshelves. A candle maker might sell more because the rooms for study needed light. Knowledge, however lofty it may seem, still needed many ordinary hands to support it. Then, in the 15th century, Cambridge entered an architectural moment that was larger, more radiant, and more ambitious. In 1441, Henry VI founded King's College. A few years later, in 1446, the first stone of King's College Chapel was laid. From the perspective of Cambridge today, That chapel is almost an inseparable symbol of the city. But at the moment it began, it was not only a beautiful building, it was a royal project, a statement in stone, an ambition to build something beyond the ordinary scale of the colleges that had come before. Imagine central Cambridge as the land was being prepared for that construction. It was not a clean, empty plot waiting to be used, according to historical records. To make room for King's College, houses, shops, narrow lanes, river landings, and even a church in the medieval center of Cambridge were cleared away for the king and those who supported the project. This was a way of opening a grand vision, but for the people who had lived and traded there, it must have been a very real change. A familiar alley vanished. A shop closed. A small landing was no longer the same. Cambridge was made more beautiful, but that beauty also passed through the lives of ordinary people. King's College Chapel grew very slowly. Stone was brought in. Builders worked through many years. Scaffolding rose. The sound of hammers, chisels, and voices calling to one another rang through the air. A building like this was not only the idea of a king, it was the sweat of masons, carpenters, haulers, planners, supervisors, cooks for the workers, those who gathered materials, and those who repaired tools. When we look at a soaring chapel, we often think of holiness and power. But if we listen closely, beneath those stone lines there is also the sound of labor, very human, very near, very enduring. Across many generations, the chapel gradually rose beside the River Cam. It witnessed changes of power, interruptions in construction, wars, and uncertain years. Yet in the end, that very length of time gave the building a deeper presence. It did not belong to only one moment. It belonged to many moments layered upon one another. Each layer of stone, each window, each stretch of wall seemed to hold the trace of different hands, different reigns, different hopes. When the chapel stood there, it did not only make Cambridge more beautiful, it gave Cambridge an image for the world to remember. While great buildings rose, ordinary life inside the colleges continued according to familiar rhythms. In the morning, bells called people to prayer or study. In the dining hall, scholars sat according to rank. A meal was not only a meal, but also a ritual. Who sat where? Who was served first? Who had to remain silent? Who read a text during the meal? All of it reflected a world with a clear order. Young students learned not only knowledge, but also how to walk, how to speak, how to live within a community shaped by rules and tradition. In the evening, when the market outside in the street had quieted, the colleges still held light. A candle burned on a table. A student bowed his head over a text. Perhaps he was tired, homesick, cold, or afraid of falling behind in his studies. But beyond the window was a quiet courtyard, and somewhere nearby, others were also studying. Loneliness was therefore divided into smaller pieces. That is what the college did for Cambridge. It turned learning from a scattered individual effort into a shared life. People did not study alone. They studied in a space built to remind them that they belonged to a tradition longer than themselves. Through the 15th and 16th centuries, Cambridge continued to expand. New colleges, new patrons, and new buildings gradually changed the lines of the town. In 1546, Henry VIII founded Trinity College. The birth of Trinity marked another stage in the story of Cambridge. Larger scale, clearer royal power, and the gathering of academic resources into a college of great influence. But even when speaking of kings and large colleges, we should still remember that Cambridge lived through people smaller than those who appear in history books. The courtyard sweeper, the cook, the laundress, the gatekeeper, the copyist, the gardener, the person carrying books, the one lighting candles in the chapel when evening came. That is what makes medieval Cambridge feel alive. It was not only a place of minds at study, it was also a place of countless quiet labors. A college needed bread every day. It needed ale, meat, fish, vegetables, firewood, coal, candles, cloth, leather, parchment, ink, pens, timber, stone, roofing, and people to repair things. It needed contact with the town, even when tensions remained. A college gate could create a feeling of separation, but never complete separation. Inside was scholarship. Outside was life. The two sides still looked at each other day after day. And then there was another change. Quieter than stone, but able to travel farther than stone. Printing. In 1584, Cambridge University Press began its continuous annual publishing history that continues to the present day. This milestone stands at the end of the chapter like a doorway opening into a new age. Before then, knowledge moved through voices, handwritten manuscripts, classrooms, memory, and small communities. As printing developed, knowledge could leave Cambridge more easily. A printed text no longer remained only in a room, a library, or in the hands of a few scholars. It could travel by road, by river, through towns, across England, and farther still. Imagine a printing workshop in the city. The air smells of ink, paper, metal, and wood. Small letters are carefully arranged. The hands of the workers move steadily. A blank sheet goes in, then comes out with letters appearing dark and clear. The sounds of the press, the paper, and people checking the printed pages create a rhythm different from chapel bells or lecture voices. But it is still the rhythm of Cambridge. If the colleges built a home for knowledge, printing gave knowledge a road. From this point onward, ideas were not only kept within stone courts. They could leave those courts and find readers in places far away. When night falls over medieval Cambridge, we can imagine the college gates closing one by one. Outside, the voices in the streets grow sparse. The river Cam darkens beneath the cold sky. In the chapel, a small candle trembles before stone walls. In the dining hall, the sound of bowls and dishes has faded. In a high room, a student still tries to read a few more lines before sleep. Somewhere, a printer covers his tools with cloth after the day's work, and on the quiet stone courts, time begins to settle. By now, Cambridge has learned something important. If knowledge wants to live long, it needs shelter. It needs stone walls to withstand the winter wind. It needs a chapel to keep the spiritual rhythm. It needs a dining hall to turn learners into a community. It needs a library to protect memory. It needs a printing workshop to carry ideas out of small rooms. From the temporary lodgings of the first scholars, Cambridge has reached stone courts and chapels, where the city begins to take on a form we still recognize many centuries later. And from that foundation, a new chapter will open, when Cambridge will not only preserve old knowledge, but gradually become a place where new ideas change the way human beings understand the world. Imagine Cambridge on a morning at the end of the 16th century. The city is still small, still filled with narrow streets, with the sound of bells, the sound of horses, the voices of people going to market, and wooden doors opening into the cold air. But somewhere within the city, another rhythm of sound is rising, the sound of paper being set down, of metal type being arranged, of printing ink, of the craftsman's hands working again and again. In 1584, Cambridge University Press began its continuous publishing history. This was not only a milestone in printing, it was the moment Cambridge learned how to send its voice beyond its ancient walls. A printed book may seem very ordinary to us today, but at that time, it was like a small boat carrying ideas far away before printing developed. A text often had to be copied by hand, slowly, expensively, with room for error, and with difficulty reaching many people. A printed book, however, could reproduce the same content many more times, more consistently, and spread it more widely. From a printing workshop in Cambridge, words could leave the city, travel by road, by river, through towns, through schools, churches, libraries, and the desks of scholars. Before entering debates in places very far from the River Cam, in a city that had long lived by books, the arrival of printing changed the intellectual atmosphere. The colleges still kept the rhythm of prayer, study, and debate, but now, knowledge had a new body, identical pages, printed copies that could be held, reread, sent away, and preserved. Imagine a young scholar holding a newly printed book in his hands. The smell of paper, the smell of ink, the lines of text appearing clearly beneath the window light. That book was no longer a single handwritten manuscript that had to be guarded like a treasure. It was part of a wider current, in which Cambridge not only learned from the world, but also began to speak to the world. Then, as the year 1600 arrived, a name appeared within that current. William Gilbert of St. John's College. He published De Magnete, a work on magnets and magnetism that held great importance for navigation and map-making. For someone listening tonight, magnetism may sound like a dry concept, but if we place it in the context of that age, we can see that within those pages, an entire world was opening. Human beings went to sea, watched the stars, used the compass, crossed distant waters, and the farther they traveled, the more they needed to understand the invisible forces that helped them find direction. From this point on, Cambridge was no longer only a place where old knowledge was reread. It began to become a place where human beings tried to understand things the naked eye could not see. A small piece of metal turning toward the north, a compass needle trembling quietly, an invisible force pulling it in a certain direction in everyday life. That might seem small, but for those who asked questions, it opened the feeling that the world was not made only of objects that could be touched. Beneath the familiar surface, there were quiet, steady, patient laws waiting to be recognized. Not long after that, Cambridge became connected to another question, one much closer to the human body. In 1628, William Harvey of Gonville and Caius College published his famous work on the movement of the heart and blood in animals. Let us pause for a moment with that image. The heart beats inside every person's chest, day after day, when we are awake, when we sleep, when we are anxious, when we are at peace. For a long time, human beings had felt that the heart was the center of life. But truly understanding how blood moved through the body was another story. Harvey's work helped open a new way of seeing. The body was not only a sacred mystery or a collection of ancient beliefs, but also a system that could be observed, reasoned through, and understood by careful method. In these centuries, Cambridge was like a city slowly turning the direction of its gaze. Before, many great questions revolved around theology, law, philosophy, and ancient texts. Those things still mattered deeply, but alongside them, the natural world began to move toward the center. Magnets, blood, motion, light, the sky, plants, animals, number, geometry, force, orbit. All of them gradually became subjects worthy of serious study. The city of chapels and libraries began to become a city of observation and experiment. Even though modern laboratories had not yet appeared as they would in later centuries, then Cambridge arrived at one of the greatest moments in its intellectual history, Isaac Newton. If we tell Newton's story too quickly, he can easily become a distant monument, a name so large that it loses its human shape. But let us try to see him within the atmosphere of Cambridge, among quiet rooms, sheets of paper, calculations, and questions stretching across days and nights. Newton was not simply a genius appearing from nowhere. He was part of a Cambridge that had accumulated centuries of books, mathematics, debate, academic discipline, and rigorous habits of thought. In 1687, Newton published Principia Mathematica, the work that established the foundational principles of modern physics. It was a milestone that made the sky and the earth no longer feel separate as before. A falling apple, the moon's movement, planets circling the sun, tides, orbits, gravitational force, all could be placed within a deep mathematical order. The world suddenly became both more wondrous and more understandable, not because it lost its mystery, but because human beings realized that mystery had structure, had law, and could be written down in the language of mathematics. Imagine a very quiet night in Cambridge after Newton's time. Outside, the rooftops sink into darkness. The River Cam drifts silently beneath the sky. Stars appear above the chapel towers. For many people, the sky was still the sky of beauty, religion, seasons, and direction. But after Newton, that sky also became a system of motion that could be calculated. A planet was not only a wandering point of light, it was an object under force, moving according to laws deeper than ordinary sensation. Cambridge had helped humanity look up at the heavens in a new way, not only to gaze, but also to ask why. What is especially remarkable is that those great ideas did not make Cambridge lose its quietness. On the contrary, they made that quietness deeper. A small room could contain a question about the universe. A wooden table could be the place where calculations changed the way humanity understood motion. An ancient library could hold, in silence, books that many later generations would continue to seek out. Cambridge at this moment was like a lamp placed behind a window from outside. That light looked small, but inside, It illuminated very long roads of thought. After Newton, Cambridge continued to be a place where mathematics, observation, and scholarship held important roles. But the world outside was also changing. Exploration, navigation, trade, engineering, industry, and new questions about nature meant that human beings needed more than old systems of theory. They needed measurement, classification, calculation, comparison, construction, and travel. Cambridge could not remain only a place that preserved tradition if it wanted to keep living. It had to allow new questions into its classrooms and onto its desks. By 1812, a Peterhouse student named Charles Babbage began to form his first ideas about a calculating machine. Babbage had not yet created the modern computer as we know it today. But in his mind there was already a very bold question. Could machines perform complex calculations more accurately than human beings? Place that question inside a Cambridge still very far from our electronic world. There were no glowing screens, no keyboards, no small devices tucked into pockets. There were only gears, metal, paper, numerical tables, calculation errors, and the desire to turn precision into machinery. Babbage revealed a new direction for Cambridge ideas. If Newton saw mathematical laws in the motion of the universe, Babbage saw the possibility of putting mathematics into machines. Both began from very abstract things, yet both touched material life. One helped human beings understand celestial bodies. The other opened a dream of calculating machines, which later became a distant part of the history leading toward the modern computer. Cambridge, therefore, was no longer only asking, "How does the world work?" It was beginning to ask, "What tools can human beings build in order to think better?" Then, in 1831, another turning point appeared, this time not from the sky or from machines, but from the living world. Charles Darwin, then associated with Christ's College, was recommended by the botanist Professor John Stevens Henslow to join the survey voyage of HMS Beagle as a naturalist. This image is beautiful if told slowly. A young man in Cambridge, among books, teachers, gardens, specimens, and lessons, suddenly opened to a voyage across the sea. From the quiet streets of Cambridge, Darwin's path would lead to South America, islands, fossils, birds, reptiles, strata, forests, coastlines, and countless observations that would later help change biology. Here, Cambridge was not the whole story of Darwin, but it was an important part of his departure. A teacher recognized the ability of a student. A recommendation was made. A door opened. History sometimes passes through moments like that, not loud, not certain, but with very long consequences. If Darwin had not been placed within the right network of people, the right teacher, the right opportunity, the scientific story of the 19th century might have been different. Cambridge, then, was not only a place that produced ideas in closed rooms, but also a place that connected people with journeys beyond the city itself. Imagine Darwin before he left. Still a young man in the atmosphere of Cambridge, the pathways, the ancient trees, the classrooms, the conversations with Henslow, the natural specimens, the unhurried days of observation. Perhaps, at that time, he did not yet know where the voyage would take him. No one knew. But that very uncertainty is what makes history come alive. A scientific journey does not begin with an answer. It begins with the ability to pay attention, the ability to look very closely, the ability to record small things and remain patient before the complexity of the world. From Gilbert to Harvey, from Newton to Babbage, from Darwin to changes in the curriculum, Cambridge gradually became a city of ideas in a broader sense. Not only ideas in theology or classical learning, not only debates within old traditions, but ideas that could look into a compass needle, into the heart, into planets, into numbers, into machines, into fossils, into living creatures, into distant lands. The ancient city beside the River Cam was expanding its mental map. In 1851, the Natural Sciences Tripos was held for the first time, opening the way for the natural sciences within Cambridge's curriculum and loosening the long dominance of mathematics and classical studies. This was a very important milestone, but it should not be seen as a dry administrative detail. It shows that Cambridge was officially recognizing that the natural world needed a place of its own in university life. Plants, stones, animals, chemistry, physics, biology, observation, and experiment were no longer only side interests for a few curious individuals. They began to enter the educational structure of the city. Imagine that change as another door opening inside a very old house. That house had long contained rooms for theology, law, classics, mathematics, and philosophy. Now, another door opened onto the garden, the specimen room, the laboratory table, the microscope, stones, plants, bones, solutions, measurements, and concrete natural phenomena. Cambridge did not throw away its past. It added a new direction of vision to that past. This is what allowed the city to keep growing, not by forgetting what it had already possessed, but by allowing new questions to find a place beside old traditions. This chapter, then, is the story of Cambridge as it moved from a city of books into a city of questions widening outward toward the entire world. Printed books helped ideas leave the rooms where they were born. Natural science helped human beings look again at things that had seemed familiar. Magnets, blood, the sky, motion, calculating machines, living creatures, fossils, and the diversity of life. Newton made the heavens understandable through force and mathematics. Babbage saw in calculation a mechanical future. Darwin stepped out of Cambridge to see life in the broader depth of the earth. And the Natural Sciences Tripos showed that the city had begun to change from within. In the very way it taught young people to look at the world. When night fell over 19th century Cambridge, we can imagine a scene very different from medieval Cambridge, yet still carrying a strange continuity. The River Cam still flowed. The colleges still stood. Bells still rang across the rooftops. But inside the rooms, people were no longer only reading ancient texts. They were calculating orbits, examining specimens, debating the body, machines, nature, life, and the unknown. On a table, there might be a printed book, a notebook, a stone sample, a machine drawing, a letter, or a measuring instrument. The city was still quiet, but that quietness now contained more movement than ever. And it is here that Cambridge prepared to step into a new chapter. Ideas had found a home. Books had found a road. Science had gained an increasingly clear place in academic life. But to look more deeply into matter, light, atoms, electricity, life, and technology. Cambridge would need other spaces, modern laboratories, precise instruments, larger research communities, and also the people who had been kept outside the doors of knowledge for many centuries. That story will bring us to a more modern Cambridge, where women struggled for the right to study, where experimental physics opened the invisible world, where DNA computers and new science continued to change the city beside the River Cam. But before we move on, let us hold the image of this chapter, Cambridge as an ancient lamp, its light shining not only down onto the page, but beginning to reach out toward the sky, the body, machines, and life. As Cambridge entered the modern age, the city did not abandon the things that had made it beautiful. The River Cam still flowed beneath the bridges. The colleges still stood behind ancient gates. The chapel bells still rang through the morning mist. The lawns remained green. The libraries still held the scent of old paper, and the streets still carried the soft sound of bicycles passing by. But beneath that peaceful appearance, Cambridge was changing more deeply than ever before. This was no longer only the city of ancient texts, of mathematics, of theology, of Newton or Darwin. This was Cambridge beginning to open its doors to those who had once been left outside. This was Cambridge entering the laboratories, where human beings did not merely read about the world, but touched matter, light, electricity, atoms, life, and data. This was the Cambridge of women seeking the right to study, of physicists looking into the smallest parts of matter, of the first computers that filled entire rooms, of the DNA model, and of an ancient city gradually becoming a center of modern science. But before we enter the brightly lit laboratories, let us pause before another door. That is the door of women. For many centuries, Cambridge was a place of knowledge, but not everyone was allowed to step into that knowledge in the same way. The stone courts, dining halls, lecture rooms, and examinations once belonged to an almost entirely male world. Women could live near the city, hear of its reputation, look at the college gates and chapel towers. But the path to becoming an official part of the university was a very long, very slow road, and one that was closed many times. In 1869, Girton College was founded as a major turning point in the history of women's education at Cambridge. The fundamental aim of Girton was to help women gain access to higher education and eventually receive degrees like men. But that victory did not come immediately, according to Girton College itself. That goal was only truly achieved at Cambridge in 1948, after many decades of struggle, resistance, campaigning, and disappointment. Imagine a young woman in the 19th century coming to Cambridge, not with the welcome of wide-open doors, but with the feeling that she was stepping into a world that had not yet truly made room for her. She might love books, mathematics, classical studies, natural science. She might have a sharp memory, a strong capacity for reasoning, the patience that any student would need. But that ability had to pass through an invisible wall. The belief of the age that advanced knowledge was not a place where women should stand as equals. At Girton, early life was not splendid. The women students had to study in an atmosphere filled with both hope and scrutiny. Each examination result was not only a personal achievement, it was almost a defense of the right of an entire sex to study. A young woman who performed well did not merely prove that she was intelligent. She also proved that the door of Cambridge should never have been closed to people like her. And that gave every reading session, every written assignment, every examination, every quiet effort in the study room a very different weight. Perhaps on evenings at Girton, when light still burned behind the windows, we can imagine those students sitting at their desks, bending over their pages, hearing the wind move through the still new corridors. Outside was ancient Cambridge, where men's colleges had existed for many centuries. Here, however, another community was creating a tradition for itself. Not loudly, not easily, not as something handed to them, but by patiently winning it piece by piece. They studied not only for themselves, they studied for those who would come after them. In 1897, a proposal to allow women to receive Cambridge degrees was rejected after a highly tense vote. Girton College describes this as a heavy defeat. And it was not until 1948 that women were accepted as full members of the University of Cambridge and awarded degrees like men. From that distance, we can see clearly that history does not always move upward in a gentle line. Some forms of progress must pass through rejection, ridicule, exhaustion, and a very long wait. But in the end, the door opened, and when women entered Cambridge with fuller status, the city also became truer to its own reputation, because a place called a city of knowledge cannot forever keep knowledge in the hands of a narrow group. Modern Cambridge was not created only by scientific discoveries. It was also created by the widening of a question: who is allowed to study? Who is allowed to research? Who is allowed to sit in the examination room? Who is allowed to pass through a college gate without having to apologize for their own presence? While that struggle was unfolding, another Cambridge was also beginning to glow inside the laboratories. In 1874, the Cavendish Laboratory opened under the direction of James Clerk Maxwell, the first Cavendish professor of experimental physics. Before that, Cambridge had not had formal teaching in experimental physics in the modern sense. Cavendish was born as an answer to the new needs of the age. Science could not live only in books. It needed instruments, measurements, experiments, and space to try again and again. Imagine the early Cavendish on Free School Lane. Outside, Cambridge still looked old, with its narrow streets and college walls, but inside the laboratory, another kind of silence was forming, not the silence of a chapel or a library, but the silence of measuring instruments, wires, glass tubes, laboratory benches, and people standing very close to a small phenomenon, trying to understand it more precisely. There, even a tiny error mattered. A line of light, the movement of a measuring needle, a faint clicking sound could open a large question. Cavendish changed the rhythm of Cambridge. The city was no longer only a place where ideas were read and debated. It became a place where ideas were tested through matter. A hypothesis could not only be beautiful on the page, it had to pass through experiment. A formula could not only be written on a board, it had to touch a measured result. Cambridge began to look into a world smaller than the human eye could see. And the more it looked, the more people realized that the ordinary matter around them was not simple at all. In 1897, J. J. Thomson at Cavendish discovered the electron. If we tell it slowly, that milestone seems to have almost no grand image, no army, no castle, no soaring chapel. There was only a laboratory, equipment, cathode rays, measurement, and a conclusion that made matter no longer seem the same as before. But discoveries like that helped build the modern world. A table, a stone, a drop of water, a human body, all began to be understood as deeper structures, made of much smaller components. Then, in 1932, Cavendish went deeper still. James Chadwick discovered the neutron. John Cockcroft and Ernest Walton split the atomic nucleus for the first time, while also experimentally demonstrating the mass-energy relationship in a nuclear context. These events made Cambridge a special place in the history of 20th century physics. But with tonight's voice, we do not need to turn them into a loud cheer. We can imagine them as small lights burning very late in the laboratory, where a few patient human beings stood before their instruments and knew they had just seen a new door open inside matter. There is something very strange in the journey of Cambridge, a place that once began with a river and a hill, a place that once lived by markets and inns, a place that once built colleges to shelter books and students, had now become a place where human beings looked into the deepest parts of the atom. An ancient city beside a river was suddenly connected to the secret structure of matter. Stone walls and modern instruments did not deny each other. They stood side by side like two different ways human beings use to resist forgetting, one preserving memory, the other opening the unknown. After physics, Cambridge also entered a story that changed modern biology. In 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson identified the double helix structure of the DNA molecule at Cambridge, drawing on the important work of Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins, and their Cavendish colleagues. This is a milestone that must be told carefully, because the history of DNA does not belong to only two names. It is a story of data, X-ray diffraction images, models, reasoning, cooperation, competition, and also the injustices in how credit was recognized. Imagine the room where the DNA model gradually appeared. Metal rods, connectors, the spiral form, distances, angles, calculations, tense exchanges. It was not a mythical scene detached from life. It was a very human process, with excitement, ambition, mistakes, intelligence, and ethical shadows that history would later need to examine more closely. But its result cannot be denied. Human beings began to understand more deeply how life stores and passes on its own information. From then on, Cambridge was not only a place looking into atoms, but also a place looking into the code of life. If Newton once helped human beings understand the movement of planets, if Thomson and the people at Cavendish helped human beings see that matter had smaller structures, then DNA opened another way of seeing. Living beings were not only outward shapes, not only bones, blood, organs, or behavior. Inside every cell was an intricate order of information, quietly passing from one generation to the next. An ancient city once built with stone now helped humanity see the very small writing inside life. At the same time as those changes, another revolution was also beginning in Cambridge: computing. In 1949, EID-CC, the first stored program computer to come into regular service, operated at the mathematical laboratory of the University of Cambridge. Cambridge's Whipple Museum records EDSAC as the first stored program computer to enter regular use. The University of Cambridge also notes that Morris Wilks began building EDSAC after the war, and that the machine began operating in May 1949. Imagine a computer of that time. It did not fit neatly in the hand like our phones. It was not silent, thin, light, and polished. It was a large machine, occupying a whole space, with wires, tubes, control panels, operating sounds, and heat. Its operators did not simply press a few keys and wait for a result. They had to understand the machine, prepare the program, check for errors, and remain patient with a technology that was still very new. But within that bulkiness, a future was breathing. Machines were beginning not only to calculate in the old mechanical way, they were beginning to store instructions, run programs, serve research, and open a new age of intellectual tools. Cambridge therefore traveled from printed books to computers along a very long yet beautiful path. Printed books had once helped ideas multiply on paper. Computers helped calculations and data move through electronic circuits. On one side was printed text, thick with the smell of ink. On the other was electrical pulse inside a large device. But both answered the same need. How can human beings think beyond the limits of a single mind? How can they remember, calculate, test, model, and explore things too complex to manage with only hands and memory? In 1951, Cambridge was officially granted city status by King George VI. Cambridge City Council notes that the year 2026 marks the 75th anniversary of Cambridge's city status. Counted from 1951, this milestone appeared in the middle of a century full of upheaval, after war, after changes in British society, at a time when science, technology, and education were entering a new stage. What is interesting is that when Cambridge officially became a city, it had long already been a city in the imagination of the world, a city of scholarship, tradition, questions, laboratories, and young people who came here to search for a different path for their lives. After that, Cambridge did not stand still in its new title. In 1970, Trinity College decided to use its land and resources to create a favorable environment for high technology industry near Cambridge. After the British government encouraged universities to connect more closely with new industries, that was the beginning of Cambridge Science Park. This was a very important milestone because it carried Cambridge knowledge out of the older model of lecture halls and purely academic laboratories and into companies, products, applied research, startups, and the technology economy. Imagine that gentle contrast in the center of Cambridge. The chapel towers and college gates still stand in the gray light of morning. Elsewhere, new research and technology business areas rise, with offices, laboratories, car parks, computers, equipment, and groups of people discussing the future. People still ride bicycles through the old streets, but they also go to work in high technology companies. A city can hold two rhythms at the same time: the slow rhythm of memory and the quick rhythm of innovation. Modern Cambridge, therefore, is not told only through famous names. It is also told through ordinary people in a city of science. A woman student passing through a college gate in the 20th century, carrying a right that many generations before had demanded. A technician preparing equipment in a laboratory. A researcher sitting before data late into the night. a programmer fixing an error in a line of code, an international student riding a bicycle through the rain, a librarian returning books to the shelves, someone working in a cafe serving lunch to researchers. All of them are part of modern Cambridge, even if their names do not appear in the great timelines. What makes Cambridge special is not that it is perfect. It has never been perfect. It excluded women for far too long. It had privilege, inequality, disputes, and doors that opened only to some people. Its scientific history also contains stories that need to be looked at carefully, such as Rosalind Franklin's role in the story of DNA. But seeing both the light and the shadow is what makes Cambridge real. A great city is not great because it has no mistakes, but because it has the capacity to change, to widen itself, to revise its way of seeing, and to allow more people to enter the story. If we stand beside the River Cam on a modern evening, we can feel all those layers of time at once. The water still flows through the city as it flowed through the earliest centuries. Punt boats drift slowly beneath the trees. Students laugh softly on the way home. A college door closes. A laboratory is still lit. Farther away, in the research areas, computers are still running. Data is still being processed. Experiments are still waiting for results. Cambridge does not sleep completely. It simply shifts into another kind of silence, where the past rests beside the future. And when we look back over the whole journey, we see that Cambridge has traveled very far. From the lowland beside the river, it became a market town. From a market town, it welcomed the first scholars. From rented rooms, it built the colleges. From printed books, it entered modern science. From closed doors, it gradually opened more paths for women. From the laboratory, it looked into electrons, neutrons, atoms, DNA, and computers. From an ancient city, it became one of the symbols of research and technology. Perhaps that is why Cambridge still makes people admire it, not only because of the beautiful photographs beside the River Cam, not only because of the ancient colleges or the great names in textbooks, but because Cambridge shows us how time can accumulate into knowledge. Each generation leaves behind a stone, a book, a measurement, a question, a struggle. One more door opened. That city was not finished in a single age. It continues to be rewritten through the lives of those who come after. Tonight, as the final chapter of the main story comes to a close, hold in your mind the image of Cambridge as a two-sided city without contradiction. One side turns toward the past, with chapels, stone courts, libraries, the river, and old trees. The other side faces the future, with laboratories, computers, technology, biology, physics, and questions no one has yet answered. Between those two sides are human beings, learners, teachers, researchers, servants, builders, people once refused entry who returned to demand the right to step inside. And the River Cam still flows through it all. It flowed through the lands before there was a city. It flowed past markets, inns, colleges, chapels, printed books, laboratories, war, computers, and modern bicycles. It does not hurry. It does not need to explain. It simply carries, in silence, the shadow of Cambridge, an old city that has never truly stopped changing. And here, our journey tonight through the entire history of Cambridge slowly comes to a close. From the soft lights upon the waters of the River Cam, we have traveled far back through time, through a place that once had no chapel, no college, no great library, and none of the names the world would one day remember. We have seen that land when it was still a river crossing, when the hill was used for watching and defense, when Roman footprints, Norman power, merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople passed through it one after another. Then we saw Cambridge begin to change. Scholars arrived in the early 13th century. Rented rooms gradually became an academic community. Stone courts, wooden gates, chapels, and libraries rose into being from its small streets. Cambridge entered the age of printed books, of faith, of debate, of science, of Newton, Darwin, Cavendish, DNA, computers, women fighting for the right to learn, and a modern city that still continues to change in silence. Perhaps Cambridge is beautiful not only because it is ancient. It is beautiful because within each old layer of stone, there still remains a question that has never gone out. People came here to learn, to doubt, to try again, to look a little more deeply into the world, and to leave behind a small light for those who would come after them. If tonight's story has kept you company while you rested, please subscribe to the channel, follow the fan page, and leave us a comment telling us where you are listening from. You can also suggest which city, civilization, historical figure, or ancient mystery you would like to hear about in the nights to come. And now, let Cambridge slowly fade back into the mist. The River Cam is still flowing very softly, and you, too, may rest now.